The snow came down hard over Bavaria that March, swallowing the farmstead called Hinterkaifeck in a white silence so complete you could hear your heartbeat. It was a lonely place, a cluster of buildings huddled against a forest on the outskirts of Weidhofen, 70 kilometers north of Munich. Smoke rose from the chimney on the morning of April 1st, 1922. The cows were lowing, fed and watered. The dogs, usually first to sound alarm, had stopped barking days ago. A fire crackled inside, but by the time neighbors walked through that unlocked door, 6 people lay dead, bludgeoned with a mattock, their skulls caved in, their blood frozen into the straw of the barn floor. And here is the detail that has haunted this case for over a century. The footprints in the snow led to the house, and they never led away. Someone was still there. Hinterkaifeck translates roughly to the farm behind Kaifeck, and isolation was its only inheritance. The Gruber family had worked this plot for decades. The patriarch, Andreas Gruber, was 63, a hard man with a hard reputation. His wife, Cecilia, 72, had 3 children from her first marriage, but it was her daughter Victoria who carried the family's darkest secret. Victoria Gabriel, 35, widowed, had married Karl Gabriel in 1914. Karl went to war and was reported killed at the Battle of Arras in December of that same year. His body was never recovered. Left alone with her daughter Cecilia, then 7 years old, Victoria fell into a pattern that would define the rest of her life. Between 1907 and 1910, Andreas and Victoria were convicted of incest. Andreas served a year in prison. Victoria served a month. In 1919, she gave birth to a son, Josef, and confessed to her lover, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, that the boy's father was her own father. Schlittenbauer, a local farmer, eventually adopted the child. The farm at Hinterkaifeck was a pressure cooker of shame, violence, and silence. 6 months before the murders, the family's maid, Crescence Rieger, quit. She told neighbors she couldn't stay. She kept hearing footsteps in the attic, voices when the house was empty. She believed the place was haunted. In late March of 1922, Andreas found a newspaper from Munich lying on the property. Nobody subscribed to a Munich paper. He dismissed it. Then he noticed footprints in fresh snow, bare human prints, leading from the forest to a door with a broken lock. The footprints came to the door and stopped. That night, the family heard footsteps in the attic. Andreas took a lantern and searched the entire house. He found nothing. When neighbors offered to stay or send help, Andreas refused. He would handle it. A school friend of little Cecilia later recounted something chilling. The night before the murders, the 7-year-old said her mother had fled into the forest after a violent argument with Andreas. Victoria was found hours later, shaking. Whatever was coming, the family sensed it. On the afternoon of March 31st, a new maid arrived at Hinterkaifeck. Her name was Maria Baumgartner, 44 years old. She had been hired to replace the terrified Crescence. Her sister accompanied her to the farm, helped her unpack, and left around late afternoon. She was the last known person to see the Grubers alive. That evening, the killer came. The crime scene told a story of methodical slaughter. The victims were not killed where they slept. They were drawn into the barn through the stable, one by one. The weapon was a mattock, a farming tool with a broad, heavy blade. Each victim was struck in the head with tremendous force. Andreas Gruber was first, then Cecilia, then Victoria, then 7-year-old Cecilia Gabriel, who was struck but did not die immediately. Autopsy reports later revealed that the little girl lay in the straw for hours, alive, conscious, in agony, tearing clumps of her own hair out. The straw around her was matted with blood and dark strands. After the barn, the killer returned to the house. 2-year-old Josef was found in his bassinet, his skull crushed. Maria Baumgartner, the maid who had been on the property for less than a day, was killed in her bedchamber. 6 lives extinguished by a tool meant to break ground, not bone. And then the killer stayed. For 3 days, someone moved through the farmhouse. They fed the cattle. The animals were alive and well fed when the bodies were discovered. They cut meat from the pantry. They cooked meals on the stove. They built fires in the hearth. The bread supply was almost gone. Dirty dishes were stacked in the sink. On the night of April 1st, a local artisan named Michael Plockel was walking home when he saw smoke pouring from the farm's oven, unusual since the family typically banked their fires overnight. As he approached, a lantern was lifted from inside the house, blinding him. The smoke carried a sickening, sweet smell. He later described it as revolting. No investigation of the oven was ever conducted. The postal carrier noted the house was quiet. The coffee seller, Shirovsky, came by. The gate was open. Nobody answered. He left. On April 4th, mechanic Albert Hoffner arrived to repair an engine. He waited an hour, then worked alone on the property for 4.5 hours. He saw no one. He heard nothing. But the killer was less than 50 meters away the entire time. That same day, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, Josef's adoptive father, sent his son and stepson to check. When they reported the place deserted, Schlittenbauer went himself with neighbors Michael Perl and Jakob Sigel. They found the barn door ajar. The bodies were stacked in the barn like sacks of feed. Andreas, Kazilia, Victoria, and little Kazilia, arranged in a grotesque pile. The mattock was later found in the hayloft, still caked with blood and hair. Inside the house, Josef lay dead in his bassinet. Maria Baumgartner's body was in the bedroom she had never properly slept in. A large sum of money was untouched. Robbery was ruled out. The scene was contaminated within hours. Neighbors moved bodies, cooked themselves meals, walked through the bloodstains. By the time Inspector Georg Reingruber arrived from Munich, the investigation was effectively crippled. But one piece of physical evidence held firm: the snow. Outside, the footprints that so troubled Andreas in the days before his death remained frozen in place. They came from the forest. They stopped at the broken door, and no tracks, not one, led back out again. Who was the phantom of Hinterkaifeck? Theories have accumulated like snowdrifts over the last century. The leading suspect has always been Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor who adopted Josef, who discovered the bodies, and who had the most motive. Andreas and Victoria's incestuous relationship was a scandal that touched him directly. If he killed them in a rage, then stayed at the farm to destroy evidence, to feed the animals, to think, the timeline fits. He had the strength, the access, the motive. No proof was ever found. Another theory: Karl Gabriel, Victoria's husband, never died at Arras. After World War II, released German POWs claimed a Soviet officer with a German accent confessed to the murders. Some whispered it was Gabriel, returned from the dead to exact revenge, but other soldiers had identified Gabriel's body on the battlefield. The theory remains tantalizingly unproven. In 1927, 5 years after the killings, a stranger stopped a resident on the road at midnight. He asked for directions to Hinterkaifeck. When the resident pointed the way, the stranger laughed, declared loudly that he was the murderer, and vanished into the forest. He was never found. The case was officially closed in 1955. The last interrogations were conducted in 1986. Nobody was ever charged. The farmhouse at Hinterkaifeck was demolished in 1923, a year after the murders. The land was razed, the stones pulled apart, the hearth where the killer cooked his meals reduced to rubble. A concrete memorial now marks the spot. Locals rarely visit, but the story refuses to stay buried. It survives because of one image that lodges in the mind and will not dislodge: footprints in the snow that lead to a door and never leave. Someone went into that house and made it their own for 3 days. They ate the family's bread. They stoked their fire. They slept under their roof with 4 bodies in the barn and 2 more in the rooms around them. And then they walked back out into a world that never learned their name. The door at Hinterkaifeck opened to admit a killer. It should never have opened at all. And the question, the one that still scratches at the walls of that empty memorial plot, is not who did it. The question is how anyone could live with 6 ghosts for 3 days and not go mad. The answer, perhaps, is that they already were.